When my daughter's future mother-in-law called me useless trash in front of 200 wedding guests, I smiled, walked to the altar, and whispered 3 words to the officiant that turned their perfect fairy tale into their worst nightmare. By the time I was done, half the wedding party was in tears, and the bride's family fortune was secured forever. Justice has never tasted so sweet. You won't believe what happened next. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments what you would have done in my situation. The morning sun streamed through the cathedral windows as I adjusted my navy blue mother of the bride dress for the 3rd time. My hands trembled slightly, not from nerves about the ceremony, but from the conversation I'd overheard the night before. 24 years of raising Emily as a single mother had led to this moment, and Vivian Ashworth was determined to ruin it. I smoothed down the modest fabric, bought from Nordstrom Rack, with money I'd saved for 6 months. It wasn't designer like the 3-0 gown Vivian wore to last night's rehearsal dinner, but it was mine, paid for with honest work, just like everything else in Emily's life had been. Emily stood before the full-length mirror in the bridal suite, radiant in her grandmother's vintage lace gown that I'd spent 2 years having restored. Every bead and every pearl had been carefully cleaned and reset by hand because we couldn't afford a new designer dress. But she looked like a princess, my princess, the little girl who used to play dress-up in my work clothes and promised she'd take care of me when she grew up. "Mom, you're crying already," Emily laughed, turning to face me. "Save some tears for the actual ceremony." I wiped my eyes, careful not to smudge the makeup I'd done myself in the motel bathroom. "I just can't believe my baby girl is getting married. It feels like yesterday you were 6 years old, helping me balance the checkbook at the kitchen table. Those were the lean years after her father walked out when she was 4. I'd worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat, cleaning offices at night, waiting tables on weekends, and doing bookkeeping for small businesses during the day. Emily grew up in that world of struggle, watching her mother count every penny, wear the same interview outfit to a dozen job applications, and choose between paying the heating bill or buying groceries. But she also grew up watching her mother never give up. When other kids got tutors, I sat with her at the kitchen table until midnight, working through math problems I had to teach myself first. When her classmates went to summer camps, we had adventures in our backyard, building forts and reading library books under the oak tree. When they got brand-name clothes, Emily learned to sew, and we made her prom dress together from a pattern and fabric that cost less than most girls spent on shoes. She never complained, not once. Even when she got into Stanford, and I had to explain that we couldn't afford it without massive loans. Even when she chose the state university instead, she worked part-time to help with expenses while I took on extra clients to cover what scholarships didn't. "Do you remember when you told me about James?" I asked, adjusting her veil. "You were so nervous, worried I wouldn't approve of him." Emily's face softened. "You said any man who made me light up the way I did when I talked about him must be special." James Ashworth was special, but not because of his trust fund or his family's real estate empire. He was kind, funny, and most importantly, he saw Emily for who she was, not what she came from. When he proposed, he'd asked for my blessing first, sitting nervously in my tiny apartment kitchen, promising to love and protect my daughter forever. It had him immediately. It was his mother who'd been the problem from day one. Vivian Ashworth had made her opinion of our family clear from their first meeting. The way she'd looked around my apartment, her nose wrinkling at the secondhand furniture and discount store decorations. The backhanded compliments about Emily's quaint background and how refreshing it was to meet someone so unspoiled by privilege. "She'll come around, Mom," Emily had assured me after a particularly brutal dinner with the Ashworths. "Once she gets to know you, she'll see how amazing you are." But 18 months of engagement had only made things worse. Vivian's comments grew sharper and more personal. My job wasn't prestigious enough. My education wasn't from the right schools. My clothes weren't designer. And my opinions weren't sophisticated. At the engagement party, she'd introduced me to her friends as Emily's little mother, emphasizing the word little like it was a medical condition. I'd bitten my tongue through all of it and then smiled through the condescension and passive aggression because Emily was happy, because James loved her, because sometimes love means swallowing your pride to protect what matters most. But last night at the rehearsal dinner, Vivian had crossed a line I didn't even know existed. I'd been standing near the kitchen entrance, checking on the final details for today's reception, when I heard her voice carrying from the private dining room. She was talking to her sister Margaret, their conversation fueled by too much champagne and the assumption that nobody important was listening. "I still can't believe James is going through with this," Vivian was saying. "That girl and her pathetic mother, they're nothing but gold diggers. Do you see how she looks at our house, our cars, like a child in a candy store?" "The mother is worse," Margaret had replied, playing the martyr with her little jobs and her sad single mother story, as if raising a child alone makes her some kind of saint. "Please. She probably trapped Emily's father the same way Emily trapped James. These people know exactly how to manipulate successful men." My hands had clenched into fists, but I'd forced myself to stay still, to keep listening. "Well, at least we have the prenup," Vivian continued. "James may think he's in love, but money is thicker than romance. When this marriage falls apart in a few years, that little gold digger won't get a penny of Ashworth money." Margaret had laughed. "You always were the smart one, Vivian, making sure the family fortune stays where it belongs." That's when I'd walked away, my heart pounding with rage and something else, something that felt like opportunity, because Vivian Ashworth had made one crucial mistake. She'd assumed I was as powerless as she believed me to be. She'd assumed that 24 years of single motherhood had taught me nothing about protecting what I loved. She'd assumed that a woman like me couldn't possibly understand the game she was playing. She was wrong on all counts. Now, as I watched my daughter put the finishing touches on her makeup, I thought about the envelope hidden in my purse, the insurance policy I'd taken out 6 months ago when I first suspected what kind of people I was dealing with, the secret weapon that would either save my daughter's future or destroy it completely. "Mom?" Emily's voice brought me back to the present. "You look like you're a million miles away." I kissed her forehead gently, just thinking about how proud your father would be if he could see you today. It was a lie. Her father had forfeited the right to be proud when he chose gambling and bourbon over his family. But some lies protect the people we love, and I'd been telling those kinds of lies for 20 years. In 3 hours, Emily would walk down that aisle toward the man she loved and the family that didn't think she was good enough for him. In 3 hours, Vivian Ashworth would learn exactly what happened when you underestimated a mother's love for her child. The game was about to begin, and for once, I held all the cards. The Ashworth estate stretched across 15 acres of manicured perfection, the kind of old money showcase that appeared in architectural magazines and real estate fantasies. As my Uber driver wound through the iron gates and up the circular drive, I pressed my face to the window like a tourist, partly from genuine awe and partly to play the role Vivian expected me to play. The house itself was a monument to wealth accumulated over 4 generations. Georgian colonial architecture, with enough square footage to house a small village, surrounded by gardens that required a full-time staff of landscapers. I counted 6 luxury cars in the circular drive, not including the valet parking setup for wedding guests. This was the world James had grown up in, where money was as natural as breathing and twice as invisible. "First time here?" the driver asked, noting my wide-eyed expression. "Wedding," I managed, still staring at the fountain that probably cost more than I'd earned in 5 years. I'd been here exactly 3 times before. The engagement party, one awkward Sunday dinner, and the rehearsal last night. Each visit had been carefully orchestrated by Vivian to remind me exactly where I stood in the social hierarchy. The help's entrance, never the front door. The small talk that somehow always centered on my limitations. The casual mentions of how expensive everything was, how exclusive, how far beyond my reach. Today would be different. Today, I wasn't the supplicant begging for acceptance. Today, I was the mother of the bride, And that came with certain privileges that even Vivian couldn't take away. I paid the driver and walked toward the house, my heels clicking on marble steps that led to double doors worth more than my annual salary. The morning air smelled of jasmine and old money, that particular scent of privilege that can't be bought, only inherited. Inside, the house hummed with wedding preparation activity. Florists arranging displays that cost more than most people's cars, caterers preparing food for 200 guests, photographers capturing every detail for posterity. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a social event, a merger of families that would be discussed in certain circles for years to come. I found Emily in the main bridal suite, surrounded by her bridesmaids and a team of beauty professionals who'd been working since dawn. She looked ethereal in her grandmother's dress, every inch the fairy tale princess, but I could see the tension around her eyes that others might miss. "There you are." She rushed over, careful not to disturb her perfectly styled hair. I was starting to worry. "Just running a final errand," I said, patting my purse where the envelope rested. "You look absolutely stunning, sweetheart." The bridesmaids murmured agreement, but I caught the subtle exchanges of glances and the whispered conversations that stopped when I entered. Emily's college friends were lovely girls, but they came from the same world as James. Private schools, summer houses, and trust funds that cushioned every mistake. They'd accepted Emily because she was brilliant and kind, but they'd never quite understood what it meant to choose between textbooks and groceries. "Mrs. Parker?" A young woman with a clipboard and nervous energy appeared at my elbow. "I'm Sarah, the wedding coordinator. We need to discuss the processional order." I followed her to a quiet corner, where she spread out a diagram of the ceremony layout. "So you'll be escorted by your nephew Thomas, correct? Then you'll sit in the front row, left side, seat number 3. Seat number 3. Not the center position typically reserved for the mother of the bride, but off to the side where I'd be visible, but not prominent. Another small message from Vivian about my place in this production. "Actually," I said calmly, "I'd prefer to sit in seat number 1. Sarah's face showed confusion. "Oh, I'm sorry, but Mrs. Ashworth specifically requested that seating arrangement. Something about the photography angles being better if family members were positioned according to height?" Height. Right. Nothing to do with status or the subtle choreography of putting me in my place. "Of course," I smiled. "Whatever Mrs. Ashworth thinks is best." As Sarah hurried away, I felt a presence behind me and turned to find Vivian herself approaching, resplendent in champagne silk that probably cost more than my car. She moved with the practiced grace of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world, never questioned whether she belonged in any room she entered. "Patricia," she said, my name sounding like something distasteful in her mouth. "Don't you look appropriate?" The pause before appropriate was pure Vivian, designed to make me question whether my carefully chosen outfit was somehow wrong for the occasion. I'd spent weeks researching wedding etiquette, making sure my dress was the right color, length, and level of formality. But Vivian had a gift for making everyone around her feel like they were failing a test they didn't know they were taking. "Thank you, Vivian. The house looks beautiful for the ceremony." "Well, we spared no expense. This is James's day, after all." She gestured toward the main hall, where workers were putting finishing touches on floral arrangements that could have fed a family for a month. "I hope Emily appreciates the effort we've put into making this special for her." The emphasis on we and her was subtle but clear. The Ashworths were giving Emily this wedding, this day, this acceptance into their world. I was simply along for the ride. "She's grateful for everything you've done," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "We both are." Vivian's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Of course you are. I imagine this is quite overwhelming for someone from your background. All of this grandeur, all of these important guests. You must feel like Cinderella at the ball." The comparison stung because it was partly true. I did feel out of place among these people with their easy wealth and casual entitlement. But Cinderella had something Vivian hadn't counted on. She'd had a fairy godmother looking out for her. "It's certainly impressive," I agreed. Though I have to say, the most beautiful thing here is seeing how happy Emily and James are together. Yes, young love is charming. Vivian's tone suggested that charm wore off quickly, though, of course, marriage is about so much more than feelings. Compatibility, shared values, similar backgrounds, the practical considerations that ensure long-term success. She was warming up to something. I could feel it. This wasn't casual small talk, but a prelude to whatever message she wanted to deliver before the ceremony began. I'm curious, she continued, her voice dropping to a more intimate register. What do you think Emily will do after the honeymoon? Will she continue working? Or does she plan to focus on supporting James's career? The question seemed innocent enough, but I sensed the trap beneath it. Emily had a master's degree in environmental science and worked for a nonprofit focused on sustainable development. It was meaningful work that paid modestly, but aligned with her values. I knew she planned to continue her career. She had discussed it with James extensively. She loves her work, I said carefully. I think she'll find a way to balance everything. Vivian's expression suggested doubt. It's just that James's position requires certain social obligations, charity boards, business dinners, and travel for networking purposes. The wives in our circle understand that supporting their husband's success is a full-time commitment. There it was. The expectation was that Emily would abandon her own ambitions to become an accessory to her husband's career, that she'd transform from an independent woman into a perfectly polished society wife. Emily and James seemed to have worked out their own arrangement, I replied. For now, yes. But when children come, when James takes over more responsibility in the company, priorities have a way of clarifying themselves. Vivian's smile was patronizing. I'm sure Emily will come to understand what's expected of her, what's best for the family. The family, not Emily and James's family, but the Ashworth family, with its traditions and expectations, and unspoken rules about who mattered and who didn't. I was about to respond when James himself appeared, looking handsome and nervous in his morning coat. His face lit up when he saw me, and for a moment I remembered why I'd liked him from the beginning. Mrs. Parker, you look wonderful. He kissed my cheek warmly, and I could see Vivian's slight frown at his genuine affection for me. Is Emily ready? I know I'm not supposed to see her, but I'm getting pretty anxious. She's perfect, I assured him, and she can't wait to marry you. I'm the lucky one, he said, and meant it. I still can't believe she said yes to a guy like me. It was a sweet sentiment, but also revealing. Even James, with all his privileges and advantages, felt insecure about deserving Emily's love. Perhaps that was what had drawn them together. Two people who'd found something rare and precious and were determined to protect it. James, darling, Vivian interrupted, you should get ready. The guests are starting to arrive, and we don't want to keep everyone waiting. He nodded and squeezed my hand before heading toward the men's preparation area. I watched him go. This young man who loved my daughter and had no idea that his mother was orchestrating moves against her happiness. He's a good boy, Vivian said, following my gaze. Perhaps too good for his own welfare sometimes. Too trusting, too willing to see the best in people who might not deserve it. The words hit their target. I was the person who didn't deserve James's trust or affection, the outsider who'd somehow infiltrated their perfect world through my daughter's manipulation of their son's good nature. But as I watched Vivian's satisfied expression, I felt something crystallize in my chest. This woman had underestimated me in every possible way. She'd assumed I was weak because I was poor, stupid because I wasn't formally educated, and powerless because I didn't come from money. In 2 hours, she would learn exactly how wrong she'd been about all of those things. The sanctuary of St. Augustine Cathedral had been transformed into something from a fairy tale. White roses and peonies cascaded from every pillar, their perfume mixing with the scent of beeswax candles and old stone. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the marble floor where my daughter would soon promise her life to a man whose family considered her a beautiful mistake. I took my assigned seat in the third position, front row left, and surveyed the assembled guests. 200 of the most influential people in the city, dressed in designer clothes and carrying themselves with the casual confidence that comes from never having to check a price tag. Old money, new money, political connections, business partnerships. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a networking event disguised as a celebration of love. Behind me, conversations buzzed with the particular energy of high society gatherings, stock portfolios, vacation homes, children's acceptances to prestigious universities, the kind of problems I'd never had the luxury of worrying about. But I listened carefully, filing away names and connections and relationships that might prove useful in the coming years. "Patricia?" A warm voice interrupted my observation, and I turned to see Elena Morrison, one of the few people here I actually considered a friend. She'd been Emily's high school guidance counselor, the woman who'd helped navigate the maze of college applications and scholarship opportunities. When I'd been too overwhelmed to know where to start, "Elena, I'm so glad you could make it." I stood to hug her, genuinely pleased to see a friendly face in this sea of strangers and barely concealed critics. I wouldn't miss it for the world. Emily was one of my favorite students, so determined. Elena's eyes swept the ornate sanctuary with something like awe. "This is quite something, isn't it?" "It's certainly impressive," I agreed, sitting back down as Elena took a seat behind me. "Emily always said you were the one who convinced her she could achieve anything she set her mind to." "She didn't need convincing, just encouragement. That girl has steel in her spine, just like her mother." The compliment warmed me more than it should have. Steel in her spine. If Elena only knew how much steel I was about to need. The organ music swelled, signaling the beginning of the processional. Conversations died away as 200 heads turned toward the back of the cathedral. I felt my heart rate increase, not from wedding nerves, but from anticipation of what was coming. James appeared at the altar, flanked by his groomsmen, looking every inch the successful young man he was destined to become. His face was radiant with happiness and nervous energy, scanning the crowd until his eyes found mine. He smiled and nodded slightly, a gesture of appreciation that his mother would probably find inappropriate, but that meant the world to me. The bridesmaids began their procession, Emily's college friends and her cousin from my side of the family, all looking beautiful in sage green dresses that complemented the floral arrangements. I watched each of them pass, remembering the shower and bachelorette party where I'd felt like an outsider looking in on their world of casual affluence and effortless sophistication. Then the music changed to the traditional wedding march, and the entire congregation rose as one. My daughter appeared at the back of the cathedral, ethereal in her grandmother's restored lace gown, her face glowing with joy and love and absolute trust in the future she was walking toward. She was alone. We discussed this extensively with father to give her away. She'd chosen to walk the aisle by herself, making her own choice to join her life to James's. It was symbolic and modern, and exactly right for the strong, independent woman she'd become. But as I watched her make that long journey down the aisle, I felt a pang of sadness for all the father-daughter moments she'd missed, all the masculine protection and guidance that had been absent from her life. I'd tried to be both parents, but there were some roles I simply couldn't fill. Tonight, James would promise to love and protect her forever. But what happened when his family decided she wasn't worth protecting? What happened when love wasn't enough to overcome class differences and social expectations? Emily reached the altar, and James took her hands, his face full of such genuine adoration that for a moment, I forgot my concerns about his family. This was real, whatever else might be true. These two young people loved each other completely, and that had to count for something. The officiant, Reverend Matthews, raised his hands to address the congregation. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Emily Parker and James Ashworth in holy matrimony. I found my attention drifting from the familiar words to the faces around me. The Ashworth side of the family looked appropriately solemn and dignified, but I caught glimpses of expressions that suggested not everyone was entirely happy about this union, particularly Vivian's sister Margaret, who kept glancing at me with barely concealed disapproval. On my side of the aisle, the handful of relatives and friends I'd been able to invite looked somewhat intimidated by the grandeur of their surroundings, but genuinely happy for Emily. My sister Rosa, who'd helped raise Emily during the early years when I'd been working multiple jobs, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. My elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who'd tutored Emily in mathematics when we couldn't afford professional help, beamed with pride. If anyone has any reason why these two should not be joined in marriage, Reverend Matthews intoned, "Speak now, or forever hold your peace." The traditional pause followed, usually a moment of ceremonial silence before the vows began. But as the seconds stretched, I became aware of rustling behind me, whispered conversations that seemed to be building towards something. That's when I heard Vivian's voice. Not quite loud enough to interrupt the ceremony, but clearly audible to those around her. "It's such a shame," she was saying to Margaret, her tone carrying that particular quality of disapproval disguised as concern. "James is such a good boy, so trusting. He has no idea what kind of people he's getting involved with." My spine stiffened, but I kept my eyes fixed on Emily and James, who were fortunately too focused on each other to hear the commentary from the peanut gallery. "The mother particularly," Margaret replied at the same volume. "Did you see her at the rehearsal dinner? Completely out of her element. No breeding, no class, just grasping at opportunities above her station." "It's not her fault, really," Vivian continued with false charity. "Some people simply don't have the background to understand how things work in families like ours. They confuse generosity with genuine acceptance." The words were carefully chosen, designed to sound sympathetic while delivering maximum insult. Other guests were beginning to notice the conversation, heads turning slightly, eyebrows raising at the inappropriateness of the timing and location. "Still," Margaret pressed on, "you'd think she'd have enough self-awareness to know she doesn't belong here. All those years of struggle and poverty, and ain't just washed that off with a department store dress and borrowed jewelry." Borrowed jewelry. I touched the simple pearl necklace at my throat, my grandmother's only valuable possession, passed down through 3 generations of women who'd worked with their hands and loved with their whole hearts. Not borrowed, earned through sacrifice and loss, and the kind of strength these women would never understand. Reverend Matthews was continuing with the ceremony, but I could see tension spreading through the congregation like ripples on a pond. Even James seemed to sense that something was happening behind him, his shoulders tensing slightly as he tried to maintain focus on his bride. "The whole situation is just sad." Vivian's voice rose slightly, whether from emotion or alcohol from the pre-ceremony reception. "These social climbers, they think marriage is their ticket to a better life. They don't understand that breeding tells that class distinctions exist for good reasons." That's when Elena Morrison's voice cut through the whispered conversation like a blade. "Mrs. Ashworth, perhaps this discussion could wait until after the ceremony?" The suggestion was polite but firm, and it drew attention to what had been happening. Suddenly, the discreet murmurs became obvious to everyone within several rows. I could feel faces turning toward us, toward the drama unfolding during what should have been Emily and James's perfect moment. Vivian's face flushed red, caught between embarrassment at being called out and anger at being corrected by someone she considered beneath her social standing. "I'm simply concerned about my son's future," she said, her voice now clearly audible throughout the front section of the cathedral. "Your concern is noted," Elena replied coolly, "but perhaps your son's happiness should be the primary consideration today." And that's when Vivian made the mistake that would change everything. "Happiness?" She actually laughed, a sound sharp enough to cut through the organ music and reverent atmosphere. "Happiness doesn't pay bills or maintain social standing. That girl and her useless mother have been playing a long con from the beginning, and anyone with half a brain can see it." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire, impossible to take back or ignore. I felt 200 pairs of eyes turn toward me, waiting to see how I would respond to being called useless in front of everyone who mattered in my daughter's new life. Emily and James had finally heard enough to realize something was wrong. My daughter's face was pale with mortification and growing anger. James looked confused and increasingly upset as he processed what his mother had just said about the woman who'd raised the love of his life. This was the moment I'd been preparing for. The confrontation that would define every relationship in this room going forward. I could shrink back into my assigned role as the grateful outsider, accepting the insult and hoping it would be forgotten. I could cause a scene that would ruin Emily's wedding day, but establish my dignity. Or I could do something else entirely. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of everyone's attention, and walked not toward Vivian, but toward the altar where my daughter and her future husband waited. My purse felt heavy in my hand, weighted with the envelope that contained the power to flip this entire scenario on its head. "Reverend Matthews," I said clearly, my voice carrying throughout the cathedral, "before these vows are exchanged, there's something that needs to be addressed." The cathedral fell into absolute silence, the kind of quiet that made every breath audible, every rustle of fabric sound like thunder. I stood at the foot of the altar steps, feeling the weight of 200 pairs of eyes and the trembling of my own hands as I opened my purse. Emily's face was a mask of confusion and growing panic. "Mom, what are you doing?" James stepped forward, his expression protective but bewildered. "Mrs. Parker, is everything all right?" Behind them, Vivian had risen from her seat, her face flushed with embarrassment and rage. "This is completely inappropriate. Reverend Matthews, please continue with the ceremony." But I was already walking up the altar steps, my heels clicking against marble in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. The envelope in my hand felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Containing as it did the power to either save my daughter's future or destroy her happiness forever. "Emily," I said softly, reaching for her trembling hands. "Do you trust me?" Her eyes, so like her father's but with the steel I'd taught her, searched my face. Around us, the wedding party stood frozen, not sure whether to intervene or flee. The congregation buzzed with whispered speculation, but I could hear Vivian's voice rising above the rest. "James, stop this immediately. Your wedding is being hijacked by a woman who clearly can't handle the stress of the occasion." "Sweetheart," I continued, ignoring everything but my daughter's face. "6 months ago, you told me about some concerns you had, about the prenup James's family insisted on. Do you remember?" Emily's face went pale. We'd had that conversation in my tiny kitchen, over cups of coffee and growing anxiety about the documents James's lawyers had presented. She'd tried to explain the complex legal language, the clauses that seemed designed to protect the Ashworth fortune while leaving her with almost nothing if the marriage failed. "Mom, this isn't the time." "It's exactly the time," I said firmly, "because Mrs. Ashworth just made it clear that she expects this marriage to fail, that she's counting on it." I turned to face the congregation, my voice carrying to the back rows. "Last night, I overheard a conversation where James's mother expressed her certainty that my daughter was a gold digger who would be divorced within a few years. She seemed quite pleased about the prenup that would ensure Emily would get nothing." Gasps echoed through the cathedral. James spun around to stare at his mother, his face cycling through disbelief, hurt, and growing anger. "Mother, you didn't." "I most certainly did not," Vivian began, but I cut her off. "What you didn't know, Mrs. Ashworth, is that your conversation motivated me to take some action of my own." I held up the envelope, letting everyone see it clearly. 6 months ago, when Emily first showed me the prenup your lawyers drafted, I hired someone to look it over. Emily's grip on my hand tightened. "Mom, what did you do?" "I hired the best family law attorney I could afford. Actually, the best I couldn't afford. I took out a loan against my house to pay for her services. And what she found in that prenup was very interesting. The silence in the cathedral was now complete. Even the organ music had stopped. Reverend Matthews looked like he wanted to disappear into his vestments, caught between completing his ceremonial duties and managing what was becoming a very public family drama. I opened the envelope and pulled out a thick stack of papers, holding them high enough for everyone to see. You see, Mrs. Ashworth, your lawyers made a mistake. A very expensive mistake. James stepped closer, his voice tight with controlled emotion. What kind of mistake? The kind that happens when wealthy families get careless about details because they assume the other party is too poor and stupid to hire proper representation. I looked directly at Vivian, who had gone very still. The prenup your family insisted on contains a clause that was supposed to protect your son's inheritance, but the way it's written, with the specific language used, it actually does something else entirely. I handed the papers to James, watching his face as he scanned the pages that had been marked with yellow highlighter. According to the legal analysis I commissioned, if this prenup is signed as written, any assets accumulated during the marriage, including James's inheritance, his stake in the family business, and his trust fund distributions, become marital property subject to equal division in case of divorce. The sound that came from Vivian was somewhere between a gasp and a choke. Margaret grabbed her sister's arm, both women staring at the papers in James's hands like they contained a death sentence. That's impossible, Vivian whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. It's not impossible, I replied calmly. It's what happens when expensive lawyers draft complex documents quickly and assume no one will check their work carefully. The clause on page 7, subsection 3, then meant to protect premarital assets, contains language that inadvertently converts those assets to marital property the moment they're commingled with joint accounts or used for shared expenses. James was reading faster now, his business education allowing him to parse the legal language that would have been gibberish to most people. His face went through several expressions before settling on something that looked like admiration mixed with disbelief. Mrs. Parker, he said slowly, are you saying that if Emily signs this prenup, she'd actually be entitled to half of everything I inherit? I'm saying that's what the document states, as written. I turned to address the congregation, many of whom were leaning forward to catch every word. Of course, I immediately brought this to Emily's attention, and we discussed how to handle it. Emily found her voice, though it came out smaller than usual. We talked about telling James and asking his family to revise the prenup, to fix the language so it actually did what they intended. But then, I continued, I started thinking about Mrs. Ashworth's attitude toward our family. The constant reminders that we weren't good enough, rich enough, or classy enough to truly belong. The assumption that we were gold diggers who couldn't be trusted. And I wondered, what would happen if we simply said nothing? The implications hit the crowd like a wave. Murmurs rose from every section of the cathedral as people realized what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a wedding drama. ITAS a masterclass in turning the tables on people who'd used their wealth and power to belittle those they considered beneath them. You kept this secret for 6 months? James asked. But he didn't sound angry. He sounded impressed. We kept this secret, Emily corrected, her voice growing stronger, because we wanted to see what kind of people we were really dealing with. And today, we found out. Vivian was now standing, her face cycling through emotions like a slot machine. Shock, rage, disbelief, and something that might have been fear. This is extortion, she hissed. You planned this whole thing to trap our family. Actually, James said, his voice cutting through his mother's accusations, they're giving us the choice to do the right thing. He looked at me with something like respect. You could have let Emily sign this document and said nothing. She would have been entitled to millions if we ever divorced. But instead, you're telling us about the problem so we can fix it. I nodded slowly. Because that's not the kind of people we are, Mrs. Ashworth, despite what you think of us. The cathedral was buzzing now, conversations breaking out as guests processed what they were witnessing. This wasn't the society wedding they'd expected to attend. This a real-time demonstration of family dynamics, power, and the difference between wealth and character. Reverend Matthews finally found his voice. Perhaps we should postpone the ceremony until this matter can be resolved privately? No, Emily said firmly, surprising everyone, including herself. We're not postponing anything. She turned to face the congregation, her voice carrying clearly through the cathedral. My mother just showed you exactly why I'm proud to be her daughter. She could have kept quiet and potentially benefited from other people's mistakes. Instead, she's giving everyone the chance to do the right thing. She looked directly at Vivian. The silence that followed Emily's challenge was deafening. Every person in that cathedral understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented, a moment where all the careful social pretenses were stripped away, leaving only truth and consequences in their place. Vivian stood frozen, her carefully constructed composure cracking like ice under pressure. The woman who had spent months orchestrating subtle cruelties and casual dismissals was now faced with a choice that would define her character in front of everyone who mattered in her social circle. James broke the tension by walking over to his mother, the prenup documents still clutched in his hand. Mother, is it true? Did you really say those things about Emily and Mrs. Parker? James, darling, you have to understand, Vivian began, but he cut her off. Did you call Mrs. Parker useless? Did you say Emily was a gold digger? The questions hung in the air like accusations at a trial. Around us, 200 wedding guests had become a jury, waiting to see how this family drama would resolve itself. I could hear whispered conversations, cell phones being turned off silent mode as people realized they might want to record what happened next. Margaret tried to come to her sister's rescue. James, your mother was simply expressing concern for your future. Surely you can understand that parents worry when their children make significant decisions. Significant decisions, Emily repeated, her voice sharp with hurt and anger. Is that what you call marrying me? A significant decision that requires damage control? That's not what she meant, James said quickly, but his defense lacked conviction. He was staring at his mother, waiting for her to deny the accusations, to explain away the cruelty that had been witnessed by so many people. Instead, Vivian made the mistake of doubling down. Fine, she said, her voice rising to carry throughout the cathedral. Yes, I have concerns about this marriage. Yes, I think Emily and her mother are social climbers who see our family as an opportunity for advancement. And yes, I'm grateful that the prenup will protect James's inheritance from what I believe will be an inevitable divorce. The gasps from the congregation sounded like a collective intake of breath before a scream. Even I hadn't expected Vivian to be so brutally honest in public, to confirm every accusation in front of witnesses who would spread this story throughout their social network within hours. Emily's face went white, then red, then settled into something I'd never seen before. Cold, untrolled fury that reminded me uncomfortably of her father in his worst moments. Thank you for your honesty, Mrs. Ashworth, she said with icy politeness. Now let me be equally honest with you. She turned to address the entire congregation, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd finally had enough of being polite to people who didn't deserve it. For 18 months, I've listened to comments about my background, my mother's job, and our lack of breeding. I've smiled through dinner parties where I was introduced as James's little girlfriend, and charity events where people assumed I was the help. I've watched my mother be treated like a servant in situations where she should have been welcomed as family. Her voice grew stronger with each word, and I felt a surge of pride at the woman she was becoming noticed in this moment, but throughout the months of subtle abuse she'd endured for the sake of love. I told myself it would get better after the wedding, that you'd eventually accept me once I proved myself worthy. But today, at what should be the happiest moment of my life, you've made it clear that nothing I do will ever be good enough. That my mother, who raised me alone while working 3 jobs, who sacrificed everything so I could have opportunities she never had, will always be useless in your eyes. Vivian tried to interrupt, but Emily's voice rose above hers. So let me tell you what's going to happen. We're going to finish this ceremony because James and I love each other, and we're not going to let your prejudice ruin our wedding day. But after that, you're going to have to decide what kind of relationship you want with your son and your new daughter-in-law. She walked down from the altar and stood directly in front of Vivian, close enough that their conversation could be heard by everyone in the front section. If you want to continue treating my mother and me like we're beneath you, that's your choice, but it comes with consequences. James and I will build our life together without your input, your approval, or your money. We'll sign a revised prenup that actually protects your precious fortune, and we'll make our own way in the world. The threat was subtle but clear. Vivian would have her prejudices, but she'd lose her son in the process. On the other hand, Emily continued, if you're willing to acknowledge that you've been wrong, that my mother deserves respect, and that I deserve to be treated as an equal member of this family, then we can start over. But it starts with an apology. A real one, in front of everyone who heard you insult us. The cathedral was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. This was the moment that would determine not just the future of this wedding, but the entire dynamic of family relationships going forward. Vivian looked around at the faces surrounding her, all focused on her response. Her husband Richard, who'd been notably silent throughout the confrontation, stepped closer and whispered something in her ear. Her sister Margaret was shaking her head slightly, as if warning against capitulation. But it was James who ultimately forced the decision. Mother, he said quietly, I love you. But I love Emily more, and I won't stand by while you treat her family poorly. If you can't apologize sincerely and change your behavior, then Emily's right. We'll build our life without you. The words hit Vivian like a physical blow. Her face crumpled as she realized that her son was choosing his fiancée over his family, that her attempts to drive a wedge between them had instead united them against her. For a moment, I thought she might actually apologize. Her mouth opened, and I saw something that might have been genuine regret flicker across her features. But then her pride reasserted itself, the same arrogance that had created this situation in the first place. I will not be manipulated by people who are clearly trying to create division in this family, she said stiffly. This entire spectacle is proof of exactly what I've been saying. These people don't understand how to behave in civilized society. The words sealed her fate. I could see James's face harden and watched as the last hope for family reconciliation died in his eyes. Then you've made your choice, he said sadly, and so have I. He walked back to Emily, took her hands, and turned to Reverend Matthews. Father, please continue with the ceremony. We have vows to exchange. But Vivian wasn't finished. Having burned her bridges with her son, she apparently decided to burn everything else as well. This is what you're choosing? She called out, her voice echoing through the cathedral. A girl whose mother cleans toilets for a living? A family so desperate for money they'll manipulate legal documents and create public scenes to get their hands on what you've inherited? The cruelty of the words hit me like a slap. She'd found the one insult designed to hurt most. The reminder of all the jobs I'd done to keep Emily and me afloat. The years when I'd indeed cleaned offices in restaurants and anywhere else that would pay me enough to cover rent and groceries. But before I could respond, something unexpected happened. Elena Morrison stood up in her pew and began to clap. Slowly, deliberately, she applauded while staring directly at Vivian. That woman, she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, raised one of the finest young people I've ever known. She worked multiple jobs, put herself through night school, and built a small business from nothing while being a single parent. If that makes her someone to be ashamed of, then your values are more twisted than I thought. One by one, other guests began to stand and clap. Not all of them, many of the Ashworth family friends remained seated, looking uncomfortable but unwilling to openly oppose Vivian. But enough people rose that it became clear the room was divided, and the division wasn't falling along the lines Vivian had expected. James's business partner stood. His college roommate and best man rose from his position at the altar. Several of Emily's former professors who'd been invited because of their impact on her education, joined the applause. Most surprising of all, Richard Ashworth slowly got to his feet and began clapping for me. Vivian spun around to stare at her husband, her face a mask of shock and betrayal. "Richard, what are you doing?" "Something I should have done months ago," he replied quietly, recognizing that we've been wrong about these people. He walked over to where I stood, still trying to process what was happening. "Mrs. Parker, I owe you an apology. My wife and I have behaved badly, and there's no excuse for it. You've raised an extraordinary daughter, and our son is lucky to be marrying her." The simple words, spoken with obvious sincerity, broke something open in my chest. For months, I'd been preparing for battle, steeling myself against insults and condescension. I hadn't prepared for kindness from an unexpected source. "Thank you," I managed, my voice thick with emotion. Vivian stood alone now, abandoned by her husband, her son, and many of the guests who'd witnessed her cruelty. The woman who'd started the day confident in her social superiority was now isolated by her own prejudice and pride. "This isn't over," she said. But the words lacked conviction. She was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and rapidly running out of allies. "You're right," Emily said firmly. "It's not over, but it's not ending the way you planned." She turned back to James, back to the altar, back to the future she was choosing despite the family drama that would now always be part of their story. "Reverend Matthews," she said clearly, "please continue with our wedding." As Reverend Matthews cleared his throat and attempted to restore some semblance of traditional ceremony to what had become the most dramatic wedding in St. Augustine Cathedral's 150-year history, I found myself looking at my daughter with a mixture of pride and amazement. The young woman standing at that altar was no longer the girl who used to worry about fitting in with James's family. She was someone who had found her voice, drawn her lines, and chosen her battles with surgical precision. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Matthews began again, his voice carrying the weight of someone determined to complete his duties despite the chaos that had erupted around him. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Emily Parker and James Ashworth in holy matrimony." The congregation had settled back into their seats, but the energy in the cathedral was entirely different now. Instead of the polite, reserved atmosphere typical of high society weddings, there was an electric tension, as if everyone understood they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. Vivian remained standing in her front row seat, isolated and defiant, while Richard had moved to sit closer to our side of the aisle. The physical geography of the cathedral now reflected the emotional divisions that had been exposed. Families split, loyalties tested, and true characters revealed under pressure. "James," Reverend Matthews continued, "do you take Emily to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" James looked directly into Emily's eyes as he answered, his voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary. "I do, and I promise to defend our marriage and our family against anyone who tries to tear us apart." The addition wasn't part of the traditional vows, but it was a clear message to his mother and anyone else who thought they could manipulate his relationship. Several guests nodded approvingly at his declaration. "Emily," the Reverend turned to my daughter, "do you take James to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" Emily's voice was strong and clear, carrying the confidence of someone who had just fought for her right to be there. "I do, and I promise to build a marriage based on respect, honesty, and the values my mother taught me." Another pointed reference that wasn't lost on anyone in the congregation. She was claiming her heritage, her upbringing, and the lessons learned in a small apartment from a woman who'd been dismissed as useless by people who'd never worked an honest day in their lives. The ring exchange proceeded smoothly, James and Emily both speaking their personal vows with an intimacy that reminded everyone why they were really there, not for the social spectacle or family drama, but to witness two people promising their lives to each other. By the power vested in me by the state of Washington, Reverend Matthews finally announced, I now pronounce you husband and wife. James, you may kiss your bride. The kiss was passionate and defiant, a celebration not just of their love but of their victory over the forces that had tried to keep them apart. The applause that followed was thunderous, coming from both sides of the aisle as guests celebrated the couple's triumph over adversity. But as Emily and James turned to walk back down the aisle as husband and wife, Vivian made one final attempt to regain control of the narrative. "This marriage won't last 2 years," she called out, her voice carrying over the applause and organ music. "And when it falls apart, don't come crying to us for help." The words were intended to wound, to plant seeds of doubt, and to cast a shadow over what should have been pure joy. Instead, they galvanized the support Emily and James had built in the room. Elena Morrison stood up again. "Some of us will be right here supporting them, Mrs. Ashworth. That's what real family does." Richard Ashworth's voice joined hers. "Vivian, that's enough. You've embarrassed yourself and our family enough for one day." But the most powerful response came from James himself, who stopped in the middle of the aisle and turned to address his mother directly. "You know what, Mother? You might be right. Marriage is hard, and statistics say many marriages fail. But if ours does, it won't be because Emily wasn't good enough for our family. It'll be because I wasn't strong enough to protect her from people who should have loved her." He paused, looking around at the assembled guests. "But I don't think we're going to fail, because we just survived the first real test of our marriage, and we did it together. Emily didn't need my money or my family's approval to become an extraordinary woman. She was already extraordinary when I met her, raised by someone who taught her that character matters more than pedigree, that integrity is worth more than inheritance." The applause that followed was sustained and genuine, coming from people who recognized courage and principle when they saw it. As Emily and James continued their recessional, guests stood and clapped, many of them wiping away tears at the unexpected emotional power of what they'd witnessed. I found myself walking out of the cathedral behind the wedding party, surrounded by well-wishers and supporters who wanted to express their admiration for how I'd handled the situation. But my attention was focused on my daughter and her new husband, walking together into the afternoon sunlight, having proven that their love was stronger than the obstacles others had tried to place in their path. Outside the cathedral, the receiving line formed naturally, with guests wanting to congratulate the couple and many of them going out of their way to speak with me. The social dynamics had shifted dramatically from the morning's expectations. Instead of being the outsider tolerated for Emily's sake, I found myself at the center of conversations about courage, family, and standing up for what's right. "Mrs. Parker," James approached me as the formal photographs began. "I owe you an apology and a thank you." "You don't owe me anything, James. You chose love over comfort today. That's all any parent could ask for their child. I should have stood up to my mother months ago. I should have protected Emily and you from her behavior. I'm sorry it took a public confrontation for me to find my backbone." I studied his face, seeing the genuine regret and newfound determination there. "What matters is that you found it. And now Emily knows she can count on you to put your marriage first." He nodded, then surprised me by pulling me into a hug. "Thank you for raising such an incredible woman. And thank you for being smart enough and tough enough to protect her interests even when I wasn't." As we separated, I saw Vivian approaching from across the cathedral courtyard. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by her isolation and the public failure of her campaign against our family. "I suppose you think you've won," she said quietly, stopping just close enough for a private conversation. "This was never about winning, Vivian. It was about respect, about treating people with basic human decency regardless of their bank account or pedigree. You manipulated this entire situation. That legal analysis, the dramatic revelation, you orchestrated all of it." I looked at her steadily. "I protected my daughter from people who were trying to harm her. If that's manipulation, then I'm guilty as charged." She studied my face, perhaps looking for some sign of the vindictive triumph she expected to find. Instead, I felt only sadness for the relationships that had been damaged by her inability to see past class distinctions to the human beings underneath. "This isn't over," she said again. But the threat sounded hollow now. "You're right," I agreed. "It's not over. But it's also not what you think. At Island, Emily and James are going to build a good life together, with or without your blessing. Your choice is whether you want to be part of that life or not." I turned to walk away, then looked back over my shoulder. "For what it's worth, Vivian, I hope you choose to be part of it. Emily would like to have a relationship with James's mother. If that mother could learn to treat her with the respect she deserves." The reception that followed was unlike any wedding celebration I'd ever attended. Instead of the formal, reserved affair typical of high society gatherings, it became a genuine party where people who'd been strangers that morning bonded over shared values and the extraordinary drama they'd witnessed together. Emily and James's first dance was met with sustained applause, not just for their grace as a couple, but for the courage they'd shown in defending their relationship. When James invited me to dance, the gesture was met with such enthusiastic approval that I found myself crying again. "No more tears, Mom," Emily whispered when she cut in. "Today is perfect." And looking around at the faces surrounding us, some old friends, some new allies, all united in celebration of love, conquering adversity, I had to agree. Today had been perfect, not despite the drama, but because of how it had revealed the true character of everyone involved. My daughter had married not just a good man, but a strong man who would stand by her against any opposition. And I had learned that sometimes the best way to protect the people you love is to refuse to be silent in the face of injustice. 6 months later, I was sitting in my newly renovated kitchen, reading the newspaper over my morning coffee, when Emily called with news that made me smile wider than I had in years. "Mom, you need to sit down for this." "I am sitting down, sweetheart." "What's going on?" "Vivian just called James. She wants to invite us for Sunday dinner. All of us, including you." I nearly choked on my coffee. "Are you serious?" "Completely serious. Apparently, Richard has been working on her since the wedding. And get this, she specifically asked if you would be willing to bring some of your famous tamales. The tamales she'd once dismissed as inappropriate ethnic food for sophisticated palates. The irony was almost too perfect. "And how do you feel about that?" I asked carefully. Emily was quiet for a moment. "Honestly, I'm cautiously optimistic. James says she's been different lately, quieter, more thoughtful, like the wedding was a wake-up call about what really matters." I could hear the hope in my daughter's voice, the desire to believe that people could change, that families could heal from even the deepest wounds. It was a hope I shared, despite everything that had happened. What does James think? He thinks she's trying to make amends without having to actually say the words, "I'm sorry," which is probably the best we can expect from Vivian Ashworth in the short term. I laughed at that. "Baby steps, I suppose." "Baby steps," Emily agreed. "But Mom, you don't have to do this if you're not comfortable. James and I won't pressure you either way." I looked around my kitchen at the new appliances I'd been able to afford after getting several referrals from wedding guests who'd been impressed by my handling of the cathedral confrontation. My small bookkeeping business had grown significantly in the months since the wedding, as word spread about the woman who'd outsmarted expensive lawyers and stood up to social bullies with grace and intelligence. More importantly, I looked at the photo Emily had sent me last week, a picture of her and James at his company's annual charity dinner, where she'd been introduced not as James's little wife, but as Emily Ashworth, our new board member for environmental initiatives. She was building her own identity within his world, commanding respect based on her abilities rather than her husband's connections. "Tell her yes," I said finally, "but I'm making extra spicy tamales. If she wants to eat my ethnic food, she's getting the full experience." Emily's laughter was worth everything we'd been through. "I love you, Mom." "I love you too, baby girl." After we hung up, I sat in my quiet kitchen thinking about the journey that had brought us to this point. The wedding that was supposed to be Emily's fairy tale had become something much more valuable, a defining moment that established the terms of every relationship going forward. James had kept his promise to put his marriage first. When his mother's sister Margaret had tried to organize a family boycott of Emily and James's new apartment, he'd made it clear that anyone who couldn't treat his wife with respect wouldn't be welcome in their lives. The extended family had quickly adjusted their behavior accordingly. Richard Ashworth had surprised everyone by becoming one of Emily and James's strongest supporters. He'd privately apologized to me several more times, acknowledging that he'd been a coward for not standing up to his wife's behavior earlier. He'd also proven his sincerity by recommending my services to several of his business associates, helping my company grow beyond anything I'd imagined possible. Most importantly, Emily and James's marriage had thrived under the pressure that might have destroyed a weaker relationship. They'd learned early that they could depend on each other, that their partnership was strong enough to withstand outside interference. The prenup had been rewritten by mutual agreement, with terms that protected both families' interests while ensuring that Emily would be financially secure regardless of what the future brought. The tamales I would make for Sunday dinner wouldn't be a peace offering or an attempt to curry favor with my daughter's in-laws. They would be a declaration: this is who I am, this is where I come from, and this is the culture that shaped the woman you now call daughter-in-law. Take it or leave it. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed Elena Morrison's number. "Patricia, I just heard the news from Emily. Vivian Ashworth invited you to dinner?" "Apparently so, with specific requests for tamales." "Well, I'll be damned. Maybe there's hope for that woman after all." Elena had become more than just Emily's former guidance counselor. In the months since the wedding, she'd become a friend, someone who understood the challenges of building a life without the safety net of inherited wealth, someone who appreciated the strength it took to protect your children while teaching them to stand up for themselves. "Elena, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you think I did the right thing? At the wedding, I mean." "Sometimes I wonder if I should have handled it more quietly, more diplomatically." Elena was quiet for a moment before answering. "Patricia, do you know what I've been doing for the last 6 months?" "What?" "Using your story in my sessions with students and parents, especially the ones who are dealing with class differences, financial pressures, and family disapproval of their choices. I tell them about a woman who raised a brilliant daughter alone, who was smart enough to protect that daughter's interests even when powerful people tried to take advantage of her, and who was brave enough to stand up for what was right even when it would have been easier to stay quiet." My eyes filled with tears. "Elena, you didn't just save Emily's future that day. You showed a room full of people what integrity looks like. You proved that character matters more than money, and that intelligence and preparation can overcome privilege and arrogance. How many young women do you think will remember your example when they face their own challenges?" I hadn't thought about it that way, hadn't considered that the confrontation at the cathedral might have meaning beyond my own family's immediate situation. "Besides," Elena continued, "diplomatic solutions only work when you're dealing with people who argue in good faith. Vivian Ashworth was never going to change her behavior based on polite requests and private conversations. Sometimes public accountability is the only thing that works with bullies." "And you think she's really changed?" "I think she's learned that actions have consequences. Whether that translates to genuine personal growth remains to be seen. But at least she's stopped underestimating the people she considers beneath her social standing." After Elena and I said goodbye, I walked out to my small backyard garden where I'd been growing the vegetables and herbs I used in my cooking. The tomatoes were coming in beautifully, and the cilantro was ready for harvesting. Perfect timing for Sunday's tamale preparation. As I worked in the garden, I found myself thinking about the lessons I'd learned over the past 6 months, about the difference between being poor and being powerless, about the importance of preparation, of thinking 3 moves ahead when dealing with people who consider you an obstacle to their plans, about the value of quiet allies who might not speak up immediately, but who will stand with you when the moment comes. Most importantly, I'd learned that sometimes the best way to protect the people you love is to refuse to accept the limitations others try to impose on your family. Emily hadn't needed me to fight her battles for her. She'd proven perfectly capable of standing up for herself when the moment came. But she'd needed to know that she wasn't alone, that someone had her back, and that her family was worth defending against anyone who tried to diminish or dismiss them. My phone buzzed with a text from Emily. "Just talked to James. He's excited about Sunday dinner. He says you've never made tamales for the family before, and he can't wait to try them." I smiled and typed back, "Tell him to bring his appetite, and maybe some antacids." Her response came immediately, "LOL, Mom, you're terrible, but I love you anyway." Sunday dinner at the Ashworth house would be interesting, no doubt about it. There would probably be awkward moments, careful conversations, and the delicate dance of people trying to rebuild relationships after serious damage had been done. Vivian might revert to her old patterns, or she might surprise everyone with genuine growth and change. But regardless of how it went, I would walk into that house as Emily's mother, James's mother-in-law, and a woman who had proven she couldn't be intimidated or dismissed. I would bring food that represented my heritage, my culture, and the love I'd poured into raising my daughter. And I would do it all with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced her worst fears and emerged victorious. The wedding day confrontation that had started as my nightmare had become my triumph. Not because I'd humiliated enemies or proven my superiority over people who'd looked down on me, but because I'd shown my daughter and myself that we were worth fighting for. Sometimes justice really is served best, with tamales and a side of humble pie. And sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply refusing to be the victim others expect you to be. As I headed back into the house to start planning Sunday's menu, I found myself humming the wedding march. Not because I was reliving past drama, but because I was celebrating the beginning of a new chapter, one where my family's place at the table was no longer up for negotiation. The game had changed, the rules had been rewritten, and this time, everyone knew exactly where they stood. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what you would have done in my situation. Would you have revealed the prenup secret publicly, or handled it differently? Your thoughts and experiences matter to me, and I read every comment. To listen to more stories about family drama, justice served, and standing up for what's right, click on the suggested videos. Remember, sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to accept the role others assign to you.